General Lemay imagined that he faced an enemy spoiling for a fight. But the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was not yet ready to take the bait, as his son recalls.
My father's greatest fear was that West will know how weak we are. And so he wanted the Soviet Union to be accepted as the great power. He was realist. He understood that our GNP at that time was 1/5 of United States GNP, so it was impossible to compete. It was only one possibility to do this. It is to use the threat of the using nuclear weapons.
Moscow skies are filled with the first public display of Russia's newest combat aircraft.
So Khrushchev engaged in a game of bluff. He created the appearance of having more long-range nuclear bombers than he in fact possessed. Lemay's intelligence officers fell for the trick.
Skill and production ability may have been seriously underrated. Russia's major strides toward air supremacy forced urgent reappraisal of America's defense strategy.
The issue at the time was the bomber gap. Supposedly the Soviets had more bombers than the United States, and not only had more bombers, but was going to produce more bombers. Keep in mind, what we did is we saw a bomber. We counted that bomber as being operational. When we knew that there is no bomber force in the world that you can look down and say all bombers are operational.
President Eisenhower doubted Air Force claims, but in 1956, intelligence chiefs persuaded him to authorize a series of spy overflights. Eisenhower insisted the CIA, not the Air Force, be in charge.
His experience had been that the armed forces, having received an approval to do something, would extend it or do something somewhat different. He felt that the CIA could conduct this without it being a provocative act which really would come in the category of war rather than the kind of thing that intelligence agencies did during so-called peacetime.
The first mission of the U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union was on July 4th, 1956. That same day, Khrushchev made a friendly gesture toward his enemies.
It was the flight of the U-2, and the flight of the U-2 not on the ordinary day, but on the July 4th. And not only on the ordinary July 4th, but it was second time in the post-war history where Soviet leadership decided to visit American embassy. So for him, it was the blow and the demonstration from the American government that we can and we will do what we want.
That particular mission, we flew over the long-range bomber bases in the Ukraine and Leningrad. We flew deeper into the Soviet Union, over Moscow, and covered more bomber bases. The missions that we flew that essentially went up to the Urals proved fairly conclusively that there was no bomber gap. 2 months after the National Photographic Interpretation Center came in the beam, we had solved one major problem, and that was the bomber gap didn't exist.
Despite photographic evidence that showed Lemay had greatly overestimated the Soviet bomber threat, in June 1957, with the help of powerful friends in Congress, he was promoted to Vice Chief of the Air Force. He handed the command of SAC to his old friend and colleague, Thomas Power. If further expansion of SAC was no longer justified by the bomber gap, the Soviet Union's next achievement provided a brand new threat.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket. You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite.
The Soviets, of course, launched Sputnik. And there was criticism of everybody. There was criticism of the academic community. There was criticism of the U.S. missile program. Keep in mind that most of our missiles were blowing up on the pads. So the so-called missile gap began to develop, that we were way behind the Soviets.
Lemay, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1. 2, 1
Well, when we flew the satellites in '60, that proved conclusively that not only was there no bomber gap, no missile gap, and no megatonnage gap. And that's when Eisenhower, in one of his last ventures as a president, denounced the danger of an unbridled military-industrial complex.
A hotly contested election campaign closes with Senator John F. Kennedy.
The election of 1960 was fought around the bomber and missile gap. John Kennedy successfully argued that Eisenhower had failed to prevent the Russians from gaining superiority over the United States. But once in office, the Kennedy administration became suspicious of what the military was up to. A senior Pentagon official was the first civilian to see the war plan. What he found shocked him.
The reason it had the name Joint Strategic Capabilities Plan, which is rather obscure and innocent sounding kind of plan, sounds rather logistical, like a capabilities plan of some sort. It was that they wanted to prevent civilian authority from being fully aware that there was a single piece of paper that expressed the Joint Chiefs of Staff operational plan for all-out nuclear war.
What Ellsberg found confirmed the administration's worst fears. SAC was an air force with only one response to any problem: total nuclear annihilation of the enemy. In Washington, Kennedy gathered a team of experts to provide a more flexible and graduated strategy.
General Thomas Power heard about this crazy briefing that was going on in Washington mostly, and demanded of General White that I be shipped out to Omaha to talk with him and his staff. And he had me come to his briefing room and had assembled all his key generals. He said, you know, you academic, lily-livered types from the Rand Corporation, all you want to do is save lives. I'm going to dispose of them. He said that he would regard it as victory if there were 2 Americans and only 1 Russian left. He really didn't seem to be fully in control of himself. It was as though I was witnessing some strange performance in which this 4-star general was displaying several different personalities.
Despite the reports coming in on his top generals, Kennedy maintained cordial relations in public, both with SAC High Command and General Lemay. Lemay, however, had begun to think the unthinkable and question who should have authority to launch a nuclear strike.
I'd really never heard it questioned by anyone that it was appropriate for the president to make that life and death decision, life and death not just for Americans, but for most of the world. And Lemay did question it. He added to, he brought out himself the point. He said, after all, should the president even be in the loop for that decision, which is Pentagon language, meaning should he be part of the decision process, even if he were alive? And he was smoking a cigar, I remember, in a way that looked very tough, and he growled, and he said, after all, who's better able to make that decision? A man who's been preparing all of his adult life to make that decision, face that question, or some politician who may have only been in office a few months.
That politician, John F. Kennedy, would soon face the greatest crisis of his presidency: Soviet missiles 90 miles off the coast of Florida. For the man who wanted World War III, this could be his chance.